Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. So greetings and welcome, Andrew. It's really good to have you on the podcast show.
Thanks for having me, Bilal. It's great to meet you. Great to be on.
Now, before we go into our the more meaningful part of our conversation, I do like to ask my guests something about their origin stories. So it'd be great to hear what you studied at university. Was it inevitable you'd end up going into sort of China and economics and politics and so on? So perhaps something about your life story.
Yeah, for sure. It was the furthest thing from inevitable that I would end up as a China analyst. That I would spend a decade living in Beijing and now be based in DC. I am from Amarillo, Texas, a city of about 200,000 people in the Texas Panhandle, which is about halfway between Dallas, Texas, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. And it basically, the only reason it exists is, well, there's oil and cattle out there, but it basically sprang up many, many decades ago as a place people stopped as they were moving across, the country going west. And now still people will say to me, oh, I've driven through Amarillo, Texas. No one ever stops there. They might stop for gas, but that's about it. If my parents listen to this, they're going to be upset. But that's kind of its raison d'etre. Anyway, so I went to Texas A&M as an undergrad and studied American studies. And just through a series of mishaps, ended up teaching for a year in Hong Kong. And that's where I caught the China bug. So I just was like, this place is fascinating. Went to grad school, study international relations. And the first class I took was international monetary theory. And I was like, no, this is fascinating. This is where it's at. And so I just basically ended up getting a degree in Chinese econ, like the econ of China. I took a bunch of econ classes, took a bunch of China classes, and I was talking to an actual economist the other day, and I described myself as a China economist, and they were like, oh, I didn't know a China economist was a thing. I thought they were just economists and not, and non-economists. I didn't know there was just a category of China economists, but that's what I am, and that's kind of how I got here. But it's been a good run, and it's certainly been a place of increasing interest in the past few years. So
no, that's really good. That's a great story there. And if I do ever go to Texas, I'll make sure I go and stay in your town. Now on when you said China economics, so what does that mean exactly? China economics then as a subcategory?
It's a good question. I mean, I think as everybody your listeners will probably know, China doesn't defy the laws of economics, so to speak, but it certainly has a unique development model. I mean, there are aspects of it that we've seen in other East Asian countries, and to an extent, even sort of the German industrialization and kind of mercantilist, approach to development. But it's got a ton of unique characteristics and a ton of contradictions. Is it a state-controlled economy or a market-based economy? It's both. It's obviously led by a communist party. It's the biggest country in the world, obviously, in terms of population. You go there, and Shanghai is a developed world city, and you drive not too far and you're in the middle of rural areas that have about the same development level as sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a walking contradiction, or I guess not a walking, but a living contradiction, if you will. And so I think understanding the, idiosyncrasies and unique aspects of China's development model, generally a relationship between the government and the market, that's kind of what makes, the field of China economics, I would say, unique. And there's a good tension, I would say, between, there's people who are sort of looking at China who, went to China as a journalist and just got to know China really well, and then sort of became China economists, like, Arthur Krober at Gavcow is like a perfect example. And then there are people who are just, have been economists for years and then take those methods and apply them to China. And there's a tension between those folks because there's some people coming at it really from the economic lens, and there's others who are coming at it from the China-specific lens, and you kind of have to have both sides really to understand, to have a, I would say, a robust kind of framework for trying to know what's going on.
And what one feature of China in recent years has been the dominance of President Xi. Politically, he seems
Yep.
to be exerting a lot of control. I mean, does he have a specific economic philosophy, or is it more about sort of political control?
That's a good question. The real answer is we don't really know. I've never sat down, unfortunately. I've never had the chance to sit down with Xi and pick his brain. I think he does have certain philosophies or tenets that he goes by. There are those that argue, and I think there's some credence to this, that Xi Jinping doesn't care about the economy itself that much. He cares much more about the political project that he's undertaking, and specifically rejuvenating the Communist Party of China and its leadership over over society, over the economy. And so that's, first and foremost. But he does care about, making China a great country and restoring what he sees as China to its rightful place as an economic powerhouse. And so I think he sees a strong economy as part of his broader political agenda. There are, he from what we can tell, he does seem to be a legitimate Marxist. A lot of people throughout the Chinese system don't believe in the ideology. There's a lot of people who think that Xi Jinping's really just kind of pushing the ideological stuff to sort of get everybody singing from the same hymn book, to kind of have a framework where everyone kind of is on the same page about certain things. But from what we can tell, it seems like he really is believes in Marxism and, dialecticalism, in that, things that we see as contradictions are not necessarily contradictions in his mind. But I think the one thing that has really solidified in his thinking when it comes to the economy is, like, his phrase that I always like to quote is that he says, the strongest economies are not the ones that grow the fastest, they're the ones with the best technology. And that, to me, is a framework for a lot of the things we're seeing happening in China, is Xi Jinping's fundamental belief that if we can't innovate, we can't own cutting edge technologies, whether that be in green tech, solar, AI, then we're not going to be the superpower I want us to be. And that's why you see so much of his energy focused on the science and technology realm.
Okay, that's a great point. And I guess when I look at the Chinese economy, like many of the outsiders, when we look at the Chinese economy, it looks like there's weak consumption, over production, oversupply, reliance on exports, but a strong tech sector, it seems.
Mhm.
Now, is that first of all a fair characterization of China, or is there something I'm kind of missing there?
I think it's a fair characterization. The question is it a moment in time, or is that fundamental to how the system works? And I think the answer is both, actually. China, the way the party governs, and the sort of incentives through the state, especially the state part of the economy, the state controlled part of the economy, tends toward overproduction. It has for years and years and years. And that's also sort of part of the socialist-led market economy. We've seen that in other, economies throughout history led by, communist or socialist regimes. And it's also part of China's unique system where the provinces really kind of compete with each other to have strong steel manufacturing, strong aluminum. So you've got if the state sends a signal all on, whatever economic priority, everyone locally invests in that. And so by definition of that competition, you end up getting overcapacity. So to some extent, it is a feature of the system. But I would say at present, it's particularly acute, and that is because, there are differences of opinion by how, in terms of how much these moves have been, taken kind of purposefully or if it's just something that's kind of happened to the leadership. But the economy is fundamentally undergoing a, a a historical evolution, if you will. They are trying to move away from property as the driver of growth, domestic growth, to what they call new productive forces or new industries that will take up the mantle of economic growth. And that's things like electric vehicles. It's things like solar panels. It's, increasingly AI and other tech and software. The problem that they're in right now is that while those industries are growing very quickly, none of them, even put together, are big enough to fill the macroeconomic hole that has been left from the property sector realignment. And so, it's going to be a few more years before they can make up that hole, and we're settling into sort of a new normal. And in the meantime, you have overcapacity from the demand side of the property sector contracting. So you've got steel and aluminum, all that stuff that would go into property being dumped, overseas, and you have the sort of traditional elements of overcapacity in, for example, the ICE vehicle sector, right? So all that is to say, as I think it's partly a moment in time as the economy's undergoing what is really a just momentous transition. And then I think there are some features of the system that, make it sort of a structural issue as well.
Okay, understood. And just on the property side, I mean, how bad is the picture now? Because I mean, this has been going on for a number of years now. There's property correction. There's some recent signs of some stabilization in property prices for what it's worth. I don't know. But I mean, could we sort of present a story that the worst of the property excesses are behind us? And now we do, and then you have this tech story. And so maybe there's something more positive we can say.
I think that's definitely right. I think, the worst is behind us. We see the numbers, whether it's investment or new construction or prices, all still in negative territory, but slightly less negative than they were last year, right? So even if the sector could be a net zero on growth this year, it would be an improvement. So yeah, we are seeing some signs of that, and that will go a long way towards boosting confidence among households and then boosting the consumption piece that we talked about. So getting a stabilization in the property sector is a huge piece of riding that economic ship. Things are improving, but we're not there yet. And the challenge, which will take years to address, is what do you do with the overhang of existing housing units? Does, right now there are policy programs in place for basically local SOEs to buy up those units, turn them into affordable housing for, people who can't afford to purchase an apartment, or at least on a commercial basis. But that's going to be an ongoing issue for years to run through that inventory. And part of that related to that issue is what we're seeing is really stabilization in the first and second tier cities, and it's the third tier cities that have the biggest property overhangs, the weakest economies. And so you're seeing through in different regions, different cities, you're seeing different levels of performance on the property sector, and so you're going to have increasing bifurcation by sort of city tier as well.
And we recently had the two sessions, where kind of the economic plan is laid out for the year. I mean, would you say anything significant came out of that? It seemed like the headlines seemed to suggest some kind of stimulus. People seem to be quite positive around it all, but when you look under the hood, it wasn't clear what was new. But what was your take?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking with my business partner about this actually on one of our recent podcasts, which he made the point, which I thought was really good, was this year's two sessions, there were no real surprises. And it basically was like a redux of last year's two sessions. Very, very boring. The GDP growth targets stayed the same. Most of the economic targets were the same. Most of the policy priorities were the same. In a way, it was refreshingly boring, right? So we were talking before we started recording, right, that there's so much volatility in the world And I mean, you look at the US, you look at what's happening in the UK, you're with large parts of Europe, dial back 12 months and everything seems totally different than it was 12 months ago. But in China, not that much has changed. The policy priorities haven't changed. The kind of trajectory of the economy hasn't changed all that much. So in a way, they are sort of in steady as she goes mode. Let's keep pressing forward, trying to address the challenges we've been addressing or looking to address for, the past year and the past several years. So I would say in that way, yeah, there wasn't a lot of big headlines. They did, though, come out with a decent, amount of support. I think people were investors have been looking for bigger stimulus out of China for, basically since the pandemic for several years now. And so they kind of met expectations in terms of what they did on the fiscal side. So they boosted basically fiscal spending by 9%, right? Had they and that was 2024 growth was just 2.7%, I think, in terms of fiscal spending growth for over 2023. So there's a big jump in fiscal spending growth. They set the budget deficit target at 4% of GDP, the highest it's been in several decades. But they just kind of met expectations. And when it comes to China, and often, when you're looking for a surprise or investors are looking for a thesis as to whether a trajectory is going to change in an economy like China's, meeting expectations is kind of disappointing, right? So it's almost like if you meet expectations, you actually come in under expectations in a weird way. And so that's, I think, basically what happened is they kind of did what everybody thought they'd do. And everyone had hoped maybe that they would come out with something that would be a bit surprising and a bit, more aggressive than they had signaled.
And I suppose this goes back to your point about tech being their biggest priority, more so than just general stimulus in the economy as a whole. And recently, of course, we've seen the success of DeepSeek, and that's really sort of seen renewed focus of investors back towards Hong Kong and China, Chinese tech stocks, dragon stocks, and such. And then there's also within this, there's this idea that President Xi's, bringing the private sector back in from the cold, and he's more supportive of them. So what I mean, what are your thoughts about the relationship between Xi and the private sector, private tech, and how that fits into the overall tech strategy?
This is a good question because the answer is really still unclear. As people will know, there's always been a fraught relationship between the state and the private sector in China, and that's gotten worse and worse under Xi Jinping for the last 13 years. And it kind of came to a head in 2020, 2021 when they undertook their tech sector crackdown, along several different lines for, anti-monopoly reasons, for, growing too quickly, for, taking actions that were, discriminatory against consumers, all kinds of different things. The tech sector just kind of, because it's the tech sector, it had gotten ahead of regulations. And this was sort of Xi Jinping and companies' efforts to say, listen, you prosper at the will of the state. We need to get on the same page. And, to some extent, I was impressed with that, in that you look at, for example, the US, a lot of people in Washington, D.C. talk about better regulating the tech sector. We bring the CEOs of the tech sector, at least we did before, Donald Trump's second term, we'd bring them before Congress and finger wag and say, you guys need to do better. You need to be better regulated, but no actual regulatory action took place. Now, obviously, the tech, CEOs are very close with Donald Trump, or many of them. And so at least China kind of put its money where its mouth was in terms of, regulating the tech sector. The issue was it was just so haphazard that it really threw the sector for a loop, and they didn't know if kind of what the rules of the road were and whether they were going to be able to basically make money and be profitable, or, were they just in the doghouse forever? And there's been a detente actually for a couple of years, since late 2023, between the Chinese government basically in the tech sector. But over the past few months with DeepSeek, the DeepSeek revelation happening, it does seem, at least, that the Chinese government is realizing, and Xi Jinping in particular is realizing, oh, actually, there is a space where we need private sector companies. And I do think we're going to look back sort of 6 months from now and see not only the DeepSeek, announcement, but the meeting that Xi Jinping had with private sector tech entrepreneurs a few weeks ago as a real pivot moment where Xi Jinping is saying, okay, I get it. There is a role that you guys have, especially in developing AI technology, that we can't do through state-led, research and R&D alone. And so we are going, now that we're all on the same page, and you prosper at the will of the state, get after it, go for it. And so I think that's the signal that the private sector has gotten. And it's one of the reasons you see the movement in equities markets. And when I talk to my colleagues and staff in China, they say it's sort of palpable. There's a feeling just among their friends when they talk to them, like China's in the game, the technology game, the AI game, and we can compete with these Western companies. And so there's really kind of a genuine level of grassroots, if you want to call it that, excitement among, at least the colleagues that I talk to in China.
And how successful would you say the Chinese tech sector is right now? Obviously, we've seen the data on EV, production and sales, which seem to be world beating at the moment. China seems to be producing more smaller chips as well. I mean, what's the scorecard you'd give for the China tech sector right now?
It's a good question. Obviously, kind of differs technology to technology. I think it's inarguable that they are leading the world in the NEV space, and I would put sort of green tech more broadly. I think, just the past couple of days, BYD has announced this new charging mechanism where you can, get 400 kilometers worth of range, I believe, in 5-minute charge, basically like going to the gas station, right? And so, there's no doubt they're leading the world there, and I think will continue to. And I think they see the NEV developments as really something they would like to replicate, right? In other technologies, like other hardware technologies, in wider battery storage, all kinds of green technology applications. So I think it's that on that side they're definitely world class. AI, harder to tell. I'm, an economist. I'm not a technologist. So, obviously DeepSeek has made some real moves. There are other companies that are, Monica, I believe is the name of one of them, with its product Manus, which people are excited about. Now people are looking for the next DeepSeek. So I think they will compete. Whether or not they can continue to compete against the big US tech companies, it remains a huge question. And there are issues around, will the export controls eventually become a bottleneck? And do you need huge amounts of compute and inference and all that stuff? Will that ultimately hold them back? Maybe. But I guess with China, my overall scorecard, I'd probably give them, a B, meaning they are doing some things really well, some things really bad, and some things sort of in the middle. And I think that's the issue when it comes to China is people, and you saw it with DeepSeek, right? It goes from China can't compete, there's no way they're out of this, to they're going to dominate everything, right? And we're constantly vacillating in the West between this belief that China is this, indomitable force, or it's collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. And the reality is they're sort of muddling through, getting some wins and some losses along the way.
So we've talked a bit about the tech sector, but at the same time, China still is a part of the global supply chain. It does still produce a huge amount of manufactured products. And interestingly, for all the talk of deglobalization, China's exports continue to pick up year after year after year. So, how do you think about China in terms of the context of deglobalization? Every country's onshoring, but yet China's exports continue to go up. Where does China fit into that whole sort of picture?
Very complicated. Obviously, it depends sort of company by company. We work with not just investors, but we also work with a lot of corporates. A lot of those companies, the Western companies, are trying to build some redundancy into their supply chain. So while many of them aren't, actively reducing their footprint in China, they're looking to set up shop, in Southeast Asia, in India, for their, marginal next facility. And so I do think that is something that's happening. Excuse me, that's happening, and that, decoupling to an extent, or de-risking now is kind of what companies call it, rather than decoupling, will continue to move forward to some extent. For its part, though, China is definitely trying to ensure that it remains a central part of the global supply chain. So just today, you saw that they were finally putting in place some of the restrictions on certain NEV technology, for example, so that the technology itself can't be exported from China. It needs to be, those processes, those manufacturing processes will be required to remain in China. So the government's trying to push back to some extent, especially on critical technology, and critical processes, so that that stays onshore in China. They've talked about doing that with some solar manufacturing processes as well. The solar industry pushed back because they want to be going more global. And that's the other piece of this is, you see Chinese companies, largely because of the tariffs, out of the US, setting up shop, whether it be in Southeast Asia or increasingly, Mexico, or even the Gulf countries, as kind of this cat and mouse game continues for Chinese producers to try to stay one step ahead of sort of the next tariff, the next, import restriction, or whatever it be, out of the US in particular, and to some extent the EU. So I think there's a lot of factors pushing towards ongoing, I'll call it de-risking rather than decoupling, but ongoing sort of, diversification of the supply chain outside of China. But China is trying to push back from a policy standpoint on that where it can. And then you look at the rising global trade tensions, totally understandable, because the things we talked about before, with China trying to remake its economy, it has a massive reliance on external demand at the moment. And as countries continue to push back against that, that's also going to incentivize, for example, NEV makers to set up shop in various parts of Europe to make those vehicles on the continent. And so all the signs point to ongoing diversification of those supply chains. And some of that's because of the moves out of the US and other Western countries. And part of that is because of the incentives of Chinese companies themselves. And so the big question will be, how much can the Chinese government slow that down so that the domestic, the economy and the domestic manufacturing processes remain a significant part of that overall supply chain. And I would say they probably have a few more tricks up their sleeves, and ultimately we're not going to see the hollowing out of the Chinese manufacturing sector, in large part because they've seen what happened to the US, and they do not want their manufacturing sector to, be hollowed out the way the US was. In fact, they talk a lot about how they don't really want to be a consumption-led, services-led economy like the US is. They want to be the German model, high-end manufacturing, very lasting imprint in global supply chains. The question is, can the German model on steroids, which is what China would be, can the rest of the world live with that? Can the rest of the world deal with that? And so I think we will see ongoing supply chain diversification. It will have limits. China will push back, but the tensions that reality is creating are not going away anytime soon.
Now we've danced around Trump so far, but let's get into it. So obviously we have Trump 2.0. I suppose one way to look at this is, what do the Chinese think of Trump and the administration, and what's the China view of things?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked it that way, because, people, I always say, I do the easy stuff. I analyze Chinese politics, not US politics. which Chinese politics used to be harder to analyze than US politics, but things have changed a lot over here. And I would say the Chinese, to start with, are they, yeah, obviously there are things that the Trump administration is doing specifically on the tariffs and some other things that are creating headaches for the Chinese, but they see very much continuity in terms of the changing of administration. They don't think much changed between Trump 1 and Biden, and they don't think much is going to change from Biden to Trump 2. Meaning they think, and I think rightly so, that there is a pretty widespread consensus in Washington, D.C., that the US needs to be sort of trying to trip up China, not only competing against China, but taking it a step further and trying to slow China down. So they see a long-term deterioration of relations between the US and China. And that's sort of a fact of life for them, no matter who is in the White House. So that's sort of their starting point. Secondly, on the Trump side, they're much better prepared for Trump 2.0 than they were for Trump 1.0. And I think everyone is, despite how volatile the back and forth on tariffs has been, everybody basically knew it was coming. They didn't quite know how bad it was going to get, especially I think the Europeans have been caught a little bit off guard. But, the Europeans as well knew that Trump likes to wield tariffs as a weapon. And so the Chinese were prepared. And you see that in their response to the first 2 rounds of tariffs that have gone on. The 10% tariffs in February are announced. China immediately comes out with sort of this multi-pronged package. And the multi-pronged package included various legal tools that they have been developing for the past 5 years exactly for this purpose. So they were 100% ready. They are continuing to approach it with the attitude of hope for the best and prepare for the worst. Right. So right now they're saying we hear the Chinese saying like 20% tariffs. That's kind of about what we thought it would be. In a way, with the back and forth on trade between China and the US, or the US and China, has been one of the least volatile aspects of the tariff announcements out of Washington, out of the Trump administration. They were ready. 20% is about what they thought. They've been prepared. They're going back and forth, but they do hold out hope that maybe high-level diplomacy between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump can move the needle in a more positive direction. And Trump has shown a willingness to move the relationship onto a more positive footing. He obviously has some sort of affinity for Xi Jinping, and the Chinese know, like, if things are going to improve, again, I already said, like, the contextual pieces, they think long term there's a deterioration, but if they can improve in the short term, it's only going to improve through leader to leader talks. It's not going to be the normal process where you have this working level conversation that kind of bubbles up and then the leaders put their imprint on it. It's going to be the other way around. Xi Jinping and Donald Trump are going to have to come to an understanding, and then that's going to have to filter down to the working level. The big question that the Chinese have at the moment is, what is the ask out of the White House? They do not understand that. And I think they're, again, it's understandable that they have this position. I don't understand what the White House is asking of China. Do we want, a lower trade surplus? Does the Trump administration want more agricultural goods, et cetera, to be bought, by China from the US? Do they want help on the fentanyl trade? Obviously that's been a stated purpose of some of the tariffs. Does the Trump administration want China to play a role in brokering some ceasefire or peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine? It's unclear to the Chinese exactly what the grand bargain would be, or even a small bargain would be, frankly, at this point. And the Trump administration is saying, we've been clear, but the Chinese don't see it that way. And as an analyst and everything that's going on, I tend to sort of agree with the Chinese view. It's not clear to me what Trump wants from Xi Jinping and wants from China. And so until that becomes clear, the Chinese will kind of be grasping at straws. But hopefully, from their point of view, that does become clear as Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, meet likely here soon to begin talks on what the shape of any kind of agreement could look like.
One criticism of China was that China in the last Trump administration promised to buy a certain amount of U.S. products, and then if you look, they didn't actually do that. Obviously,
Mhm.
Biden took over, and maybe Biden didn't enforce that. So, I mean, does China have a credibility issue around how they interact with the U.S.?
Absolutely. Even that, I would say that even if they had, to the letter of the phase one agreement adhered to it, they'd still have a credibility problem with the US. They, just by dint of the fact that they're a communist regime, they have a credibility problem with the US. But also, understandably, that credibility problem has been well earned by China over not just the phase one trade deal, but years and years of sort of signing on to agreements and not sticking to the letter of the law. The Chinese would say, and I think there's, like everything with China, there's some truth to it and there's some spin and propaganda. Their line is, listen, we inked that deal, then the pandemic happened. And there was no way we could, stick with that. And let's use that as a starting point to see if we can get back to trying to execute that phase one deal. So I think that will be a gambit of theirs to say, let's try to revisit this. I mean, I think it is true that the pandemic threw off a lot of those plans, but they probably wouldn't have adhered to the agreement anyway. But they do at least have some kind of argument to say, listen, we were kind of knocked off course here. So, yes, there's a credibility issue. But I will also say, for the Chinese, Washington has a credibility issue, right? They don't trust DC to stick to anything that they're going to say. And they also don't trust DC, and it's not just about the Trump administration. I would say it's a wider, U.S. issue. They don't trust Washington to not continue to needle them through export controls, sanctions, et cetera, while they're at the negotiating table. And that becomes a problem because, like with Trump said just the other day, just yesterday, I guess, that Xi Jinping will likely come to Washington, D.C. soon. And it becomes an issue on the Chinese side because if you send Xi Jinping to Washington and, the Commerce Department comes out with some new export control or some, listing of a major Chinese company while he's here, that is can be a big issue for Xi Jinping politically. And so I think they're trying to manage through what all those dynamics will be as well.
Okay, understood. And just on the tariffs, I mean, is there an increase in tariffs that would actually hurt the Chinese economy? So far, Trump's increased tariffs, I suppose, by 20%, as you said. During his campaigning, he said 60%, which sounds very large. I mean,
Mhm.
surely there must be a certain level of tariffs that would really start to impact the Chinese economy.
Yes, I mean, certainly, if Chinese sellers can't sell into the US at all, which would, a 60% tariff basically becomes cost prohibitive, they will feel that pain and they will have to diversify into other markets. But again, I think they look at it and they say, we're sort of being shut out of the US market generally. And so we need to
It's just
take
a question
some
of
pain
timing.
and just exactly and diversify it over time and just kind of understand that the US market's generally lost to us at this point. And I maybe ironically, it's not, the exporters that get hurt are not the behemoths. They're often small sellers on e-commerce platforms that aren't the, state controlled part of the, commanding heights of the economy. It's small Chinese businesses who are selling caskets to the US and things like that. And so from a statecraft point of view, I think the tariffs sort of don't they don't impact maybe the parts of the economy that would be most painful to the Communist Party, put it that way.
Yeah. And in terms of the rest of the world, I mean, who does China see as its growth markets?
Global South. They are all
Okay.
in. They have determined the global south, and you put it all together, and that's equal to, a Europe or a US. And it's small markets that, individually do not move the needle, but aggregated up make a big difference. And so you look at where Xi Jinping spends his time. It's all with global South leaders. He's not, he obviously has to do diplomacy and meetings with Western European leaders, and he's obviously going to try to talk to Donald Trump, but the most of his time is spent trying to develop better connections economically, politically, whatever it be, with global South countries. And so that's where they're putting as many eggs as they can. And you're seeing that in sales of vehicles, increasingly going to Brazil, we're seeing more sort of the legacy ICE Chinese vehicles being sold throughout South America and Africa. And so that's where China is focused. Ultimately, they cannot maintain the amount of reliance on exports that they currently have. So they will have to develop domestic demand over the coming years, because the numbers don't add up if they want to continue a certain level of economic growth. So I think that's a reality that they're understanding as well, is we can diversify as much as we can, put all of these eggs in the global South basket, but at the end of the day, we really do need to get domestic demand up to sort of to create the balance between supply and demand that we need to have a sustainable economy for decades to come.
Okay. And then in terms of, if we just round off with some of the geopolitical hotspots, Taiwan, what's China's sort of, goals on Taiwan, or like genuine goals on Taiwan, not what they kind of say, but
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one where, you never know what they're saying behind closed doors, but our business is looking at stated Chinese policy, and stated Chinese policy hasn't changed all that much, which is peaceful reunification is the goal. They, want Taiwan back in the fold. They don't want to have to invade it. They'll obviously leave, military option on the table, and then, but they don't want to use it. And in the meantime, they'll use these gray zone tactics, right? Information warfare, economic coercion, as basically a means to try and convince the Taiwanese people that it's inevitable. This is going to happen at some point, and you're just dealing with this behemoth that's just across the Taiwan Strait that's not going anywhere. And my understanding, actually, I was talking to contact of mine who was just visiting Taiwan, and he said he was talking to quite a few young people, and he was struck that the sort of prevailing sentiment among the young Taiwanese that he was talking to was that they don't see themselves as mainland Chinese people. They don't necessarily sort of are not in a hurry to reintegrate with the mainland, but they do sort of see it as an inevitability, and that they're not really interested in pushing back super hard against that, because they are sort of assuming it's going to happen sometime in their lifetimes either way. And there's a little bit of complacency among younger Taiwanese that at least this guy was picking up. And so that's, I think, maybe just an anecdotal piece of evidence in terms of, because I was also in Taipei earlier this year, and you don't get the sense that it is a city sort of under siege or imminently under siege. It's people are just going about their normal lives, and we see data that it's very difficult to get people to volunteer for military service and things like that. So ultimately, the view from Taipei, I think, is one that is not often really delved into. It's sort of seen as this kind of geopolitical chess piece between the US and China. But the Taipei view is interesting, I think. And again, I'd say that the mainland view is pretty consistent. We're going to just kind of squeeze the vice or tighten the vice with the gray zone tactics, and really, hopefully, ultimately, from their perspective, kind of force Taiwan to the table around negotiating towards what a peaceful reunification would look like.
and Russia. What's China's view on Russia, or how much influence should China have over Russia in relation to Ukraine, for example?
That's a good question. I've always thought that China doesn't have a ton of sway over Vladimir Putin's decisions on what he's going to do in Ukraine. We are pretty certain that Xi Jinping was caught off guard with the invasion. They Vladimir Putin was in Beijing just a few days before the invasion started. They signed this, agreement that said we are, these close strategic partners, and then boom, he goes into Ukraine. And so I don't think China has ever had a huge amount of influence in terms of trying to get Putin to back off or any of his strategy militarily. But they do see Russia as a strategic ally, and they see the world as sort of going towards, a geopolitical environment that is, multipolar, and where it is not sort of governed by alliances and sort of, especially ones that are driven by values-based decision making, but realpolitik, where countries are going to compete and assert their interests however they can, whenever they can, and they see their interests generally as aligned with Russia, and so that relationship is pretty ironclad at the moment.
Okay, great. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. I just wanted to round off with a few personal questions. One is that we do have some youngsters listening to the podcast, people who are at university, they'll probably graduate soon or have recently graduated. What advice would you give to youngsters as they enter the real world?
Find something you love and do it. I mean, I've been a China economist because I think it's fascinating and I made a career out of it. And I always said when I was in university that, I wanted to do something that didn't feel like work. And that's kind of how I feel. I get to talk to interesting people like you about China. I get to talk to my colleagues, my clients, because it's something I'm fascinated in. Now it's still work. You still got to, um, put in the time, but that's one I think that's not going to blow anybody's mind, but it really is true. If doing something you love, it doesn't really feel like work. And the second thing that we've learned when it comes to China is I always thought when I was young that I had to be the smartest person in the room, that was the goal. And what I found in becoming a China analyst was actually if I just took the time to read all the information, especially our business model is doing all that in Chinese. Read the document, read the policy document, read the readout of the meeting between the two leaders, and you'd be shocked that 95%, 98% of people don't do that. And so we just kind of haven't really internalized that. And this, I guess, the lesson for me is you don't have to be the smartest person in the room. You just have to be the most informed, most knowledgeable person in the room. If you've actually taken the time to, do the legwork, do the grunt work, look at the information, put it together in your own mind and analyze it, then you're going to be ahead of, 98, I think, percent of people. So it's not, I guess all that is to say, just put in the hard yards, and that, pays off, pays off a lot more than just trying to sort of be the smartest person at any given gathering.
Okay, understood. And then, I'm always looking for book recommendations. I mean, are there some books that have influenced you of your career, or maybe some recent books you've really liked?
Yeah, I mean, this is one. I mean, you're an entrepreneur. I'm an entrepreneur. I own Trivium with my three business partners. So I'm always trying to. I'm reading business books when I'm not doing China, trying to figure out how to better run my business. And our story is kind of a classic entrepreneurial story, which is we just wanted to work for ourselves, so we just did it. And all of a sudden, you realize, oh wow, we're not just, you know, um, working for ourselves. We have, 25 employees. We have to develop an HR policy, all this stuff. So the classic is a book called The E-Myth, and it's about, basically all the mistakes entrepreneurs make. And when I read it, we were already, I think, 2 or 3 years into the business, maybe more. And it was just like, it felt like I kept getting punched in the gut. It was kind of like, have you made this mistake? I was like, yep. Have any of you made this mistake? Yep. So for anyone who's in the entrepreneurial business, I would say the E-Myth is a great place to start because it'll let you know kind of what you're really getting into, and hopefully for other people, avoid some of the early mistakes that we made.
Yeah, that's a great book. I've read it as well. I learned a lot from that. Yeah. So finally, what's the best way for people to connect to you, reach out to you, follow your work?
Well, we've got a podcast as well. Would love to, if you're, have some of your listeners check it out. If you're interested in China, we talk about, what's happening in China every week. It's just called the Trivium China podcast. Check that out. Otherwise, triviumchina.com is our website. We've got subscription products for, casual China watchers, for investors, for corporates. So triviumchina.com and Trivium China podcast. Come check us out. We'd love for people to listen.
Great. No, thanks a lot. I mean, I learned a lot, and keep up the good work. And thanks again for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure, Blau. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.